Hello and welcome to Talkernate History, the podcast where we,
Matt?
and Max, talk about works of alternate history scenarios, and history in general. This episode will be one of a series of episodes about alternate new worlds. This one focusing on ways that the Europeans could have encountered this new world. Matt, what's the first item on the agenda today?
So first, we're going to go with the classic. We're going to start out with Christopher Columbus, the most well-known.
Perfect. Yes.
So we're going to ask sort of what happens if Christopher Columbus never makes it back? So he sinks on the way there, or his ships get lost on the way back to Spain. How is this going to affect, the new what's going to happen in the New World going forward? And I think this is a really interesting question because Columbus is so pivotal, and everything like the way. The order in which places are colonized and everything falls from this one date in 1492, which is really remarkable because actually the New World would have been discovered because in 1500 or so, the Portuguese sort of ran into Brazil by accident. That's why they're there, because Brazil juts out so far into the Atlantic, and their ships were sailing down, heading towards the Cape of Good Hope, down towards the edge of South Africa, and they ran right into Brazil. So this probably would have happened if there's. So let's say Columbus, the ships sink, they never make it back. They get lost in the Gulf Stream. The Portuguese are going to discover the New World. It's going to take a while to figure it out, but that's going to really change stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot more, maybe in the modern era, there would be more countries that speak Portuguese as opposed to Spanish. Like maybe they're the big new power in the New World, and the Spanish are, scrambling for scraps here and there, like Florida or South Carolina.
Yeah, or they may have gone even. It's going to be interesting because it's going to throw off, because the whole axis of the sort of the way that countries that the Spanish spread into the New World was through the Caribbean. Because their starting off point is the center of the Caribbean, and then they move north, they move south. The Portuguese are gonna put that so much farther south. They're gonna put it in South America, sort of the genesis of it, and that's gonna change it too, because the initial Spanish conquests were so much influenced by the fact that they were happening in islands, in easy to conquer islands, and it wasn't until 30 some years later, when around 1520, when Hernan Cortez is destroying the Aztecs, that they really encounter a large, land-based culture that can contest them. Right. Whereas it's also because of the nature of Brazil itself, with all the Amazonian rainforest and all that. Like, how is Brazil they're not gonna really be able to go that far in. It's gonna change radically the way we see the New World. Hell, what is called possibly, when the British or the French settle there. So everything's just going to get completely thrown off.
Right. You could see the Portuguese maybe encountering the Aztecs first.
Yeah, it's going to be weird too, because they probably would have run into the Incas before the Aztecs. Although true. The Incas and the Aztecs are so far away from Brazil, even today that terrain is very hard to get across. So the Incas are on the west coast of South America, which is just so far away from sort of the tip of Brazil where they're landing. So Portugal also would lack the sort of the resources of Spain, and eventually Portugal in the 16th century, in the 1500s, would become part of Spain for a while because it was conquered under Philip II. But
that's a good point.
But that didn't really change too much. Like they weren't part of Spain long enough for that to change like the culture, the character, the language of Brazil and other Portuguese colonies. But this is going to be really interesting because everything we know about the New World would have been totally different. You and I probably wouldn't be here sitting and doing this. I feel like just the way it's just very hard to see things playing out, because so much of it is timing. Are they going to settle Jamestown at the same time, the British? Are they going to, who knows what? What are the Spanish going to do now? Like, are they going to play catch up? Are they going to, but obviously everything's going to get shifted back 10 years, which is that's a big change. Like,
yeah.
And with so much of history being up to chance sometimes, like, it's really going to change the whole face of what we think of America. Or is it even going to be called America? God knows what it's going to be called.
Who knows?
Can't even really speculate, because how do we know?
Exactly. There's so much about the New World that is just so loosey-goosey, seat of your pants. Like, there's no real hard and fast rules to what can happen and can't happen, Yeah,
it wasn't like colonizing other places in like Africa or Asia, because there weren't Well, because of the way immunities with this, because the people didn't have
Oh,
the
God.
immunities to these diseases. So much of, people underestimate, and there's never been a really great estimate done on what the population of the New World was before. But I've heard estimates anywhere between 20 and 100 million people were living in, and they said, some of the earliest Spanish explorers sailing up the U.S. East, what's now the U.S. East Coast, or other explorers remembered seeing. They said it was incredible how thick the sky was with smoke from all the fires, from all the tribes that were living so close to the sea. So it's really, it's incredible how many people were really there.
There's a city site in America. I think it's somewhere around Missouri.
In Illinois, Cahokia.
Cahokia,
I've
yes.
actually, I've driven by it. So I've seen the mounds at Cahokia are still there.
Yes.
It's pretty cool, actually, if you're ever up in that area.
That this was a city site that had over 1 million people living in it. Like a gigantic collection of people all in this one place, like a Rome in the New World. And we know almost nothing about it.
We know that they traded with people as far south as like Alabama along the Gulf Coast.
Right.
And they had stuff from up in Canada. So they what's now Canada. So they were running obviously up and down the Mississippi River, which is a really cool, like the idea that they were very much linked in with other, it wasn't like, these little groups of people who were separated from each other and didn't really interact with one another. Like they had vast advanced civilizations, and we don't think of them in North America. We know like the Aztecs and the Incas, but there was other stuff too, and there was a lot of people. That's the point we're trying to say. Lots of people there, and really it's the smallpox and such are what made it look like this great abandoned wilderness, but it really wasn't. There was a lot more people there.
Yeah, and that kind of brings up a really good question, like an alternate scenario. Where what if the Europeans did not have the disease advantage, where 90% of the indigenous population was just not there anymore? Like this is something I kind of thought of. Like, what if something like a Viking incursion happens and they just happen to introduce smallpox and it runs rampant in the 1100s, the 1200s or so. And then, a good 300 years later, there's a European incursion, and they meet the New World under those circumstances. Like they've had centuries to recoup their losses.
They're ready. Well, not ready, but they smallpox isn't going to just kill everyone very quickly.
Right. They've been able to build up an immunity over time. Like what kind of world would they be encountering at that point?
Totally different, and it would be really hard to say what's happened to all these civilizations if there's 3 centuries that have passed. Like, are the Aztecs going to exist or people like that? But all I can say is that that would be really interesting, because now the Europeans have to fight for every inch of ground, and obviously they probably would bring other diseases too. Like I know they brought stuff like measles, and the common cold didn't exist in the Americas before the Spanish got there, which is remarkable, which is almost unbelievable to think. But that didn't exist, unheard of. And so they would have to have, and I think it would have taken, it would have been difficult to have conquered huge swaths of land. And you would have to, and with the size of ships and how long it took to get across and the limitations on the amount of stuff they could bring with them, it could have taken centuries to really conquer even significant chunks. You would have seen probably these little, forts set up on the coastline, and they could have very well been overrun by a much greater number of, natives who aren't destroyed by the millions by stuff like smallpox. So this would be really interesting. This would be really interesting, and it would delay sort of the development of European colonization in the New World.
Right. People get such a wrong idea of the New World and the indigenous people living there. Like they think, they lost because their culture just wasn't good enough. Like they couldn't stand up against the Europeans, and they were just fundamentally disadvantaged. Like it was very unfair. It would be as if aliens arrived at Earth after the apocalypse. Like the world is nothing but sand dunes and people with football pads riding around in dune buggies. Like Lord Humongous is like the most valid leader of Earth. and they'd like look at this and like, Earth is so pathetic, so weak. But I mean, like under these circumstances, I mean, it's completely understandable that things were messed up. Like, it was rough.
Like the story of Squanto, how he spoke English. The Indian who helped the settlers in Plymouth. Like he had been taken back to England before, and when he came back, when the Pilgrims got to Plymouth, they said, look at all these these bountiful fields of corn. Some have even been harvested. They're just waiting for us. This wasn't some sort of divine miracle. It's because the people who've been living there before were all killed because they had encountered, like, I think it was British fishermen or British explorers not that long before, and they'd all gotten like smallpox and died. That's
Right.
why. So like, and that's like why settling in areas like near the coast and in Pennsylvania were so easy. Is this? They would say like, oh, look at all these like paths through the forest. They just seem to exist there naturally. No, they had been made there by Native American tribes who had died off, many of them, or hadn't been destroyed completely, but really devastated by epidemics, originating from European settlers.
Right, right. That kind of reminds me of an event that occurs in this book by Kim Stanley Robinson. It's called The Years of Rice and Salt. Very interesting book. I highly recommend it.
I'm familiar with it, yes.
But in that book, basically all of Europe is wiped out by the Black Plague, just completely wiped out. And one of the first events in the entire book is the armies of Tamerlane coming into Hungary and just finding the fields just full of food, just like a wheat rotting in the fields, like unharvested in these empty villages. Very, very evocative of what you're talking about right here.
Yeah. But in that book, if I'm familiar, isn't it the Black Plague kills like 99% of Europe's population or something like that?
Absolutely. Basically, all of Western culture is wiped out. The Byzantines, the Franks, just everyone is gone, completely gone. So really the only thing that's left is are the Hindus of India, the Buddhists of China, and the Muslims. And that's it. Basically.
It'd be Confucians too, probably.
Oh, well, actually, I shouldn't forget. There's also the Native Americans who play a very important part in this near the halfway point.
But even that, but 99%, that wasn't the casualty rate of people in North America. There's very few diseases that probably have that rate of death coming from them. But the point is that how devastating, that so much of the conquest of North America by the Europeans was helped along by the fact that so many of the people who could have fought them died because of disease. So that's the greatest weapon the Europeans had were the diseases that lived within them. That did more than the gun. Yes, none of the native cultures had guns or cannons, and they didn't have iron or steel weapons, but it didn't matter because as long as they just gave them a bunch of smallpox infested, blankets or something like that, or just breathed on them, that was it.
Yeah, even peaceful cohabitation would not have worked in the long run. I mean, it's germs are going to kill them out regardless.
And people eventually developed immunities, but it took time, and the initial shock was because there really wasn't any mass epidemic diseases that existed in the Americas before the Europeans got there, because the Europeans they've been used to stuff like the plague at this point was still breaking out every few years. There would be not as big a flare up as the Black Death in the 1340s, but every so often the plague would erupt for a year or so. You had smallpox, you had all these infectious diseases. And now a lot of that actually may be because so many of those diseases that affect people originally came from cows and other domesticated animals and people living in close proximity with them. And there really wasn't anything like that in North America. And that may be one of the reasons why. But either way you cut it, they weren't ready for what was coming.
Okay. Now, all right. I'm going to ask a question that's a little ridiculous, a little pie in the sky.
Go ahead.
Bordering on fantasy. But what if the North American and South American continents just simply didn't exist? Like it was just a vast ocean with the occasional very small, island like a Fiji every once in a while, but basically just nothing there. Like what would the world be like today?
Completely different. Well, the changes would have to go back probably billions of years. But everything would be, probably the course of evolution and all that stuff would be entirely different. But yeah,
that's a very good point. Like, for instance, camels originally came from North America, and they crossed over the land bridge to become what we know of them today, which would not have happened.
Well, I'm talking even beyond that. Like, if the North and South American land masses were part of Pangea.
Yeah.
So, like, that's talking about a change that's so it's I mean, that's changing the whole course of everything, like even like what's happening with the dinosaurs. But let's just assume that they don't exist and humans have developed in basically it's the same history, except that there's no North and South America. That's very fantasy, but let's just go there. Like weather patterns are going to be completely different.
True.
I think when we were discussing this, I think we talked very briefly about this maybe like before we started the podcast, and like weather would be different, and like, I mean, the Europeans, I guess, in that case, if there's nothing out there, they would just, turn around and just, probably move into Africa or I don't know, move into Asia more. It'd be hard to see, but
Right.
But there's so much that never would have existed.
Yeah.
Stuff like potatoes, tomatoes, corn. They didn't exist in the old world, so they don't exist in this world either. So that's a big change too. So
Also, early human beings' migrations would be different. Like Australia might be different. The Aboriginals that we know today might be completely different. There might be like more Asian people living there, or Indo-Europeans.
that would be a
living in
huge change. That would be a landmark shift that we couldn't really even understand or be able to probably grasp the amount of change that would. Who God knows even if that would that affect. Is that going to affect stuff like the sea, the oceans? Like they're going to be totally different now. Currents are going to be different.
True.
Like everything in currents, related to weather and tides, and like everything would just be so completely different. Probably humans wouldn't even exist.
Plus, there's a lot of evolutionary changes which occurred in the New World that we wouldn't reap the benefits of today. Like, for instance, animals and plants and whatnot.
Yeah.
Like, the Columbian Exchange.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have corn, which is huge. We
Well,
put corn in everything.
Well, corn. Yeah, corn wouldn't exist because corn was a North American plant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like we put it in soda. We put it in glue.
We put it in our gas.
Everything has corn in it.
Yeah.
No tomatoes, no potatoes, no rubber. That's a big deal.
Yeah, no rubber, no pineapples,
No chocolate,
no chilies.
no tobacco.
Tobacco is a big thing. There's forms of cotton that wouldn't have existed. It's long. It's like the cotton that grows, not Sea Island cotton. It's that cotton that grows higher up. Wouldn't exist. Was it long thread or something like that? I can't remember. But that would just be totally like potatoes, stuff like that. Is something as small as potatoes and corn. Like they changed diets in Europe drastically, and they caused a huge growth in the population because a potato grows in just about anywhere, and they're hardy, and they don't need tons of attention, and you can grow a lot of them per acre. And basically Ireland, before the potato famine existed. That's the main part of their diet because they're just so easy to grow, and they grow in just about any poor soil that you can find. So, without potatoes, there was in the book What If 2, I think. Yes, What If 2. There's a little like short story at the end of one of the bigger stories, a little blurb, and some guy was like, what if potatoes didn't exist? No, Pissarro doesn't find potatoes. And he just tracked all the huge changes that exist, and the modern world wouldn't exist without this one, little plant. It's pretty remarkable. So we're talking about changes that it would be even hard to predict what they look like because the world would be so radically different than what we see today.
It's really difficult to speculate about it.
Yeah,
With
because I think
any kind of pretension of accuracy.
Yeah, because these changes would echo beyond traditional oh, he made a different choice sort of thing. It's like the currents are different. How do we account for that?
Right.
And we're not scientists, so we can't really speak. But that's really interesting. That would be the biggest alternate history I guess we've talked about so far, because that's the biggest change. That's huge. Trying to think. Also, this is something I want to touch on too. Is that people will say, people get sort of have a bee in their bonnet about this. Oh, pre-Columbian discovery, that there's there were Europeans in the New World before Columbus. And yes, they're the Vikings, L'Anse aux Meadows in northern Newfoundland, confirmed by archaeology and sources from the time. There were Europeans there before. Also there's stories about Roman coins have showed up in Venezuela. Phoenician stuff has been found in Mexico. Someone claimed they found a Roman statue buried in the Yucatan, and they couldn't have been there. There couldn't have been buried in stuff like that. And there's also even stories of people who are said to have resembled Native Americans finding their way, to Europe on ships and stuff like that. And all I want to say about that is that I have no issue with that at all. Like, I would actually believe there probably were some Europeans who managed, maybe fishermen who got blown off course who found their way to the New World. But the point is that they didn't make any measurable changes that we can see today. And that's the biggest reason why that doesn't bother me. Because I remember there's a whole show on the History Channel that was like, people, America before Columbus, like people who got there before, like, and they traced some ideas were a lot more plausible than others. No aliens, by the way. Good for the History Channel.
Right, good point.
But
it was a different time.
It was, yes. But ultimately, no lasting changes were made until Columbus, as far as we can see.
Right.
So that's like sorry for my little rant there, but like what I want to say is that I have no issue. Like maybe some Romans did make it over there on a ship that got blown off course, but the point is that they didn't change anything as far as we can tell that was permanent. So they didn't bring any diseases that we could tell, or they didn't bring anything that lasted. That's why Columbus is important. And for all people, some people, there's a lot of argument over his legacy, but that is the reason why 1492 is such a huge turning point, is because that's when constant contact begins.
Right.
We're not talking about 3 people finding their way over there, so to speak. Like, we're talking about real measurable changes that are changing the New World and the Old World for good.
Right. Well, I think that kind of wraps up our episode.
This is I know this is a little short episode, but definitely. I think it's a good discussion, though, and an interesting topic. And something a little bit different from what we've been talking about.
And if you, the viewer, have any ideas about something different to talk about, something you'd like to hear us talk about, or maybe a comment about how we've been doing, we'd love to hear from you. Please contact us at talkernatehistory@gmail.com.
Yes, please. We love getting feedback, and we want to hear more. We want to hear what our viewers want to hear more of. So just let us know. This is Matt signing off.
And this is Max signing off.
See you later, guys.
See ya.